Hello everyone, Dr. Kofi here and welcome to my YouTube channel, Tutor Med, where everything medicine is simplified. In today's video, we will look at the normal menstrual cycle. I highly recommend that you watch our first video on obstetrics and gynecology because it gives a framework for our studies. And that is the link to that video up there on the top right of the screen as shown. You can also find the link to that video in the video description below. Okay, let's begin the discussion. All things being equal, every mature female has been endowed with the ability to get pregnant. This ability is made possible because under the influence of certain hormones, which we will see soon, the woman's reproductive tract, principally the ovary and then the endometrium, undergo cyclical changes necessary for reproduction. These cyclical changes, which occur in the ovary and in the endometrium, constitutes the menstrual cycle. The aim of the ovarian changes is to release a mature egg into the fallopian tube so that it can be fertilized by a sperm to form a zygote. And then the aim of the endometrial changes is to make the endometrium conducive for implantation by the embryo, which will subsequently become a fetus and then a baby. Now, in the event that the egg released is not fertilized because there is no sperm, the endometrium, which was prepared for implantation, breaks down and comes out as menstrual blood. And this occurs every month when there is no fertilization. And so menstruation is a normal cyclical vaginal bleeding due to shedding of the endometrium. And so what can we learn here? We can infer that all things being equal, usually, the evidence that a woman is capable of being pregnant is a normal menstruation because that blood flow represents the endometrium, which was prepared for a possible implantation by the embryo, but it came out because there was no embryo to implant inside. And that is why when a woman in a reproductive age and who has menstruated before does not menstruate for some months, the first suspicion is pregnancy, although there are other causes of absent menstrual flow. And so on this slide, I want to briefly illustrate the ovarian and endometrial changes of the menstrual cycle. The changes which occur in the ovary can be seen as an ovarian cycle, and the changes which occur in the endometrium can be seen as the endometrial cycle. And so this is the ovary. The ovary contains structures called follicles. These follicles contain the eggs which will rupture to release eggs necessary for fertilization. The process of the egg release is known as ovulation. That is when the follicles rupture, as shown in the diagram. And so that is the ovarian cycle or the ovarian changes. And then here is the endometrium. Now, during the menstrual cycle, the endometrium has two layers, as illustrated by this black line. We have the basal layer and the functional layer. The basal layer is a constant component of the endometrium. However, the functional layer is the layer which is added to help in implantation. And as said earlier, in the event that fertilization does not occur and so no implantation occurs, the functional layer breaks down and comes out as menstrual blood, leaving behind the constant basal layer. And so here you can see that the endometrial cycle is made up of processes which builds up the functional layer to enable implantation if there is a zygote or an embryo. Very good. Please remember to support the channel by subscribing and hitting the notification bell for notifications when new videos are uploaded. And please do not forget to like and share our videos. Now, it is important to note that the female child is born with a fixed number of follicles. Some of them die and the rest are released during ovulation. This then means that it will get to a point in a woman's life when there are no eggs to release, a stage known as the menopause. Now let's discuss this briefly. At birth, the female baby has about 2 million follicles in total, majority of which will die as she grows up, and the rest saved to be released monthly when she reaches her puberty. By the time the female child gets to puberty, there will be about 400,000 follicles in total for both ovaries. And at puberty, some hormonal changes we will see in a minute occur, and she gets her first menstruation, known as the menarche. After her first menstruation, which is the menarche, the menstrual cycle continues monthly between every 21 to 35 days, but averagely every 28 days it occurs, until a stage it will stop permanently at old age, a stage known as the menopause. Now at this stage, there are no follicles to release any eggs, and so the woman stops menstruating permanently. Now note that once menarche begins, it is followed by a series of continuous menstrual cycles until the last menstruation, which is the menopause. There are two normal events. The key word is normal. There are two normal events which can interrupt these continuous menstrual cycles. One is pregnancy, and the other is lactation or breastfeeding. These are the two normal events. However, various pathological conditions can also lead to absent menstruation or disruptions in the menstrual cycle. Now, please remember we have said that the signal to start the first menstruation, which is the menarche, and also the regulation of subsequent menstrual cycles is by hormones. Hormones give the signal. And so let's see what these hormones are and where they come from. The body structures involved in the female reproductive cycle or the menstrual cycle, they are found in the head and then in the pelvis of the lady. And so in the head, we have the brain, as shown. There is a structure in the brain of the female, actually it's found in both men and women, called the hypothalamus, as labeled in the diagram. The hypothalamus releases a hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone. Now, the good thing is that the functions of these hormones are in their names, in that, for example, gonadotropin releasing hormone means that this particular hormone is going to instruct another structure to release another group of hormones called gonadotropins, right? Now, what I want us to note here is the difference between how the hypothalamus releases this hormone before puberty, number one, and then number two, during and after puberty. Now, before puberty, this hormone is released in a steady and constant state. This means that the levels neither go up nor come down. They are always at the steady state. But during and after puberty, this hormone is released in pulses, meaning at a certain point the levels go so high, and at certain instances it comes so down. Now, this pulsatile release is the signal which causes the first menstrual cycle to occur, hence menarche. Now, this hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, goes and then tells this structure here, which is also found in the head. The structure is called the anterior pituitary gland. It causes this structure to release gonadotropins. Remember its name. So it causes the anterior pituitary gland to release gonadotropins, and there are two of them. One, we have the follicle stimulating hormone. You can tell its function by its name, right? Good. And we have the luteinizing hormone. We will explain its function later. Now, the two gonadotropins act on the ovary, and then the ovary produces two hormones as a result of the action of these two gonadotropins. And so the ovary produces estrogen and then progesterone, and these two hormones prepare the endometrium to be receptive for implantation. There are other hormones which also work in the menstrual cycle, like inhibin, but we will not focus on that. So as you can see, it looks like a cascade. The hypothalamus instructs the anterior pituitary gland, which instructs the ovary to produce or to undergo some changes. And as the ovaries undergo its changes, it produces some hormones which also causes the endometrium to undergo some changes, all at the same time. Very good. Now on this slide, let's look at a typical 28-day menstrual cycle. Good. Each or every menstrual cycle begins with menstruation. The first day of the menstruation is the day 1 of that cycle. The number of days of menstruation in that cycle is known as the menstrual period, and it's usually 3 to 7 days, average 5 days, but it can vary from patient to patient, but usually between 3 to 7 days. Then, at day 14 of the menstrual cycle, ovulation occurs. And so for that menstrual cycle, ovulation can be said to occur 14 days after the first day of menstruation, or 14 days before the onset of the next menstrual cycle, right? And so because of that, menstrual cycle can be described as having a pre-ovulatory stage before ovulation, so before day 14, and then a post-ovulatory stage after day 14, but before the onset of the next menstrual cycle, right? Now, during each stage, some changes occur in both the ovary and the endometrium. And so, the changes that occur in the ovary during the pre-ovulatory stage of the menstrual cycle is called the follicular phase. And then during that same period, which is the pre-ovulatory phase, the changes that occur in the endometrium are the menstrual phase, which is characterized by menstruation, and the proliferative phase, which is characterized by proliferation of the endometrium to regenerate the functional layer which was shed during the menstrual phase. And then the changes that occur in the ovary during the post-ovulatory phase is called the luteal phase. And within that same period of the post-ovulatory phase, the changes that occur in the endometrium is known as the secretory phase. Alright folks, and so kindly pause here and support the channel by subscribing, liking and sharing our videos for more content. And so on this slide, let's look at the pre-ovulatory stage of the menstrual cycle. That is anywhere from day 1 to day 13. And so first we take a look at the ovary. What phase is that in the ovary? The ovarian follicular phase. And so like as said earlier on, the hypothalamus releases the gonadotropin releasing hormone, the GnRH impulses. And this causes the anterior pituitary gland to secrete the follicle stimulating hormone and then the luteinizing hormone. Now, the follicle stimulating hormone goes to the ovary to recruit about 15 to 20 follicles for maturation. But note that at the end of the follicular phase, only one follicle will mature and release its egg, and we will see how. Very good. And so on this slide, I want to highlight some important features of the follicle which would help us understand the follicular phase more. Now, this is a picture showing the different stages of follicle development. But I want to highlight here that the yellow structure you see in the follicle is the egg which will be released, and then the group of pinkish cells which surrounds the egg directly are called the granulosa cells, while the creamy layer of cells in this diagram, that layer of cells is called the theca cells. And so what I want to see here is that the egg is surrounded by granulosa and theca cells. As for the blue space between the granulosa cells, it is called antrum, but that is not my focus. I just want to highlight the granulosa cells and then the theca cells here. Very good. And so as stated earlier, the follicle stimulating hormone recruits about 15 to 20 follicles during each menstrual cycle. but I will only show 6 here, but actually between 15 to 20. And so let's say these are the follicles that the follicle stimulating hormone has recruited for a particular cycle. Now, each follicle here is a primordial follicle, meaning it's a very immature follicle. And I'm going to show the granulosa cells and then the theca cells. Now let's schematically show the two cells here. We have the theca cells. I will show with the yellowish brown and circle, and then a granulosa cell, a red circle. The main hormone which works in this follicular phase, you can tell by the name, right, is the follicle stimulating hormone, but the luteinizing hormone plays a role. The luteinizing hormone, or the LH, tells the theca cells to produce a group of hormones called androgens, and then the follicle stimulating hormone, the FSH, tells the granulosa cells to produce an enzyme which is able to convert the androgens produced into estrogens. This enzyme is known as aromatase, and so the granulosa cells are able to convert androgens to estrogens using aromatase. Now remember, we said that it is the estrogen produced by the ovary which will go and work on the endometrium to regenerate the functional layer during the proliferative phase of the endometrial changes. Now, these very high levels of estrogens goes to the hypothalamus and then the anterior pituitary gland to tell them to stop producing their products. And so the hypothalamus will stop producing the gonadotropin releasing hormone, whilst the anterior pituitary will stop producing or reduce the production of FSH and LH. What mechanism is that? That is the negative feedback mechanism. The mechanism in which high levels of a substance gives a feedback to those producing it to stop producing it because it is very high. Good. Now remember that we said the recruited follicles were growing because they were stimulated by the FSH, right? And so now that the FSH has come down because of high estrogen levels, the follicles will stop growing and then degenerate. And so a low FSH means that the recruited follicles will stop growing and then die. However, there is one follicle which will have a high number of FSH receptors, and because of the high numbers, it will be able to continue growing despite the low FSH levels. That surviving follicle is known as the dominant follicle. And so this is how it begins. It begins as a primordial follicle, just like its colleague, and then it starts growing. But when the FSH level drops, it will still continue growing to maturity because it has a high number of FSH receptors. Now, this follicle secretes more and more estrogens towards the end of the follicular phase. This overly increased levels of estrogens cause an outburst of FSH and LH via a positive feedback mechanism. So it goes to the hypothalamus and tells it to produce more of the gonadotropin releasing hormone. This hormone also stimulates the anterior pituitary gland to produce more and more of the FSH and LH. And so this mechanism is called a positive feedback mechanism. That mechanism where increased amount of a substance goes to tell its producer to keep producing it the more. And so you know that we have, or you've seen that we have two feedback mechanisms, a negative feedback mechanism and then a positive feedback mechanism. And so now the LH surge, or the surge in the LH, which means very high levels of LH, and which happens about 1 to 2 days before ovulation, results in the rupture of the follicle. Remember that the positive feedback mechanism causes very high levels of FSH and an LH, but it is the LH surge which results in the rupture of the follicle, causing ovulation. Now, so this is the follicle before the LH surge. This is how it would look like. And then after the LH surge, the follicle ruptures to release the egg. And this is ovulation. And so this sums up what happens in the ovary during the first 14 days of the menstrual cycle. We are still in the pre-ovulatory phase. We've discussed what happens in the ovary. So let's move to what happens in the endometrium during the pre-ovulatory phase. So the endometrial cycle. And so this is a diagram illustrating that. Remember we said that if there is no pregnancy, every menstrual cycle begins with endometrial shedding. And actually, this endometrium that is being shed is the one that was prepared for implantation by the previous menstrual cycle. Since no zygote came, that endometrium is shed, and then the phase is known as the menstrual phase. After being shed, the estrogen from the ovarian follicular phase regenerates the shed functional layer, again, as indicated by this arrow. This phase of regeneration is called the proliferative phase. The estrogens achieve this proliferative phase through the proliferation or the multiplication of the endometrium, such that the endometrium now starts getting taller and taller. And then the aim is to regenerate the functional layer. And then again, the spiral vessels now elongate as the endometrial layer also elongates. So the spiral vessels which became short now also become long. And this is what happens in the proliferative phase. Very good. Now let's look at the events of the post-ovulatory period. And so we begin with the ovaries. What is the phase called in the ovary? The ovarian luteal phase. Yes. Now this is how the ovary looks like post-ovulation, after ovulation has occurred. Just like we said that the FSH commands the follicular phase, here the LH is also the main hormone. The hormone which commands this phase is the LH. It is not surprising that the phase is even called the luteal phase, right? Good. Now when ovulation occurs, the egg gets out, but the other parts of the follicle remains. The word lutein in English is a yellowish pigment found in plants and then animal fats, and then also in the yolk of eggs. And so, can you guess the work of the luteinizing hormone? Luteinizing hormone, it means it luteinizes something. In other words, it makes something yellow. But what structure does it make yellow? It is the ruptured follicle, the remnant of the dominant follicle. And so the LH luteinizes the ruptured follicle. The fact that it luteinizes means it makes it yellow. And so when the remaining follicle is luteinized, it becomes, or there is a formation of the corpus luteum. What does this word mean? The corpus luteum. Corpus means body, and then luteum means yellow. And so essentially, the LH forms a yellow body called the corpus luteum. Now, the corpus luteum is responsible for the production of progesterone, the hormone progesterone. This progesterone is responsible for the secretory phase of the endometrial cycle. And so again, these very high levels of progesterone, just like estrogen did in the follicular phase, causes a negative feedback mechanism, and so it causes a reduction of the FSH and then the LH levels. Very good. Now let's see what happens to the endometrium during the post-ovulatory phase. And so we are looking at the endometrial cycle in this stage, right? And then the phase here is a secretory phase or the secretory phase. Now the progesterone produced by the corpus luteum will make the spiral arterioles grow longer and become more coiled. They become more coiled so that they can store up enough blood for the incoming embryo. Then the uterine glands in the functional layer will secrete more glycogen. so that the incoming embryo can feed on it, and then it secretes more mucus. Remember that all these are in preparation for a possible implantation. And so, as shown here in this diagram, you see that the functional layer has been regenerated, yes, and then the arterioles have grown longer, just like the length of the endometrium, right? But the coily nature is not really clear here, but it becomes coiled. And so you know what will happen to this regenerated endometrium if no implantation occurs, right? Good, there will be menstruation. Now, progesterone, the name of the hormone gives its function away. Progesterone. Gestaron comes from the word gestation. And so if you are progestation, it means that you support pregnancy. And so progesterone works to maintain the regenerated and nutrient-rich endometrium. But it can only be continuously produced when the corpus luteum persists. Remember, that's where it came from. But the corpus luteum with time will degenerate, and then the progesterone falls. And so once the progesterone falls, you remember that it is the hormone that maintains the endometrium. And so once it falls, the endometrium will break down, and then this will come out as menses. However, if there were an embryo, the embryo will maintain the corpus luteum for a relatively longer time by producing beta ACG. So the beta ACG, the hormone we use to confirm pregnancy, right? The beta ACG will maintain the corpus luteum. Yes, but for some time. So once the placenta of the developing embryo is fully formed, it will take over the function of the corpus luteum by producing adequate progesterone, which is enough to keep the endometrium until the embryo becomes a fetus, then a baby. And so even if the corpus luteum degenerates, it doesn't really affect the developing embryo that much, because the placenta will take over the progesterone secretion or secretion function. Yes, I meant to say, sorry. Very good. And so on this last slide, let's explain one very last concept. Now, if you had a woman with a 28-day menstrual cycle length, so the cycle length is from day 1 to day 28, you can tell when ovulation will occur, and it will be around day 14, right? Like we've discussed before. So here, you know that day 1 to the day of ovulation is 14 days, right? And then from the day of ovulation to the end of the cycle is 14 days. How about a patient whose menstrual cycle length is 31? How do you tell? So the cycle length we have from day 1 to day 31. Which day is the patient likely to ovulate? Will it be day 14 like the first? The answer is no. So here I want to mention one very important principle, that the pre-ovulatory phase, in other words, the follicular phase in the ovary, or the menstrual and then the proliferative phase in the endometrium. So the pre-ovulatory phase is responsible for the variation in the number of days in the cycle lengths, but the post-ovulatory phase is fairly constant. The post-ovulatory period is almost always 14 days, and so if the entire length is 31 days, it means that the pre-ovulatory phase is 31 minus 14, and that would give 17 days. It means the pre-ovulatory phase lasts for 17 days, and so the ovulation will occur around day 17. Now let's take a last example. We have a pretty woman with a cycle length of 24 days. When will the ovulation take place? So we have day 1 to day 24. So remember that the pre-ovulatory phase is almost always 14 days. So 14 days. So what it means is that the the post-ovulatory phase is almost always 14 days. And so what it means is that the pre-ovulatory phase will be 24 minus 14, and that would give 10 days. And so the ovulation is likely to occur around day 10. And so thank you for watching, and please do not forget to like and share our video, and then subscribe and put your notification bell on for more content. Thanks once again, and see you in our next video. Bye.